Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me to resurrect and review the work of Eugene Charveaux, a wonderful artist that's in the Cummer collection. I'm glad you were able to join me this evening. I'm Susan Gallo. At one time, I was education director at the Cummer, and I have been working on the Charveaux collection for the last 20 plus years. So I've been aligned with the museum in one case or another for the last 21 years. So, Eugene Charveaux. Here he is in an 1896 portrait by his friend Paul Cézanne. And you can see from the glint in his eye and the gentle expression on his face, he seems to be an amiable fellow, probably would be a good dinner partner. And Cézanne has captured him in the middle of telling a nice anecdote or something similar. This portrait is one of the favorites of the Charveaux descendants, and it is a wonderful view of the man as he started his career. But who was this man? In 1999, his daughter, Yvonne Charveaux, had most of his works, and she approached the museum to ask, would you like to have an exhibition of my father's work? And we had never heard the name Charveaux because at that point he was lost to history. We went to Benazzi, which is the encyclopedic dictionary of French painters, and indeed found that he had an entry. He was born in 1847. He was a painter and an etcher, a printmaker. He exhibited at the salons, and the line in the entry said he was a very strong artist. So with that background, then director of the museum, Karen Arbitman, handed me a stack of prints and a small composition notebook and said, see what you can make out of this. And then after a little bit of time, I went back to her and I said, do you know what we have here? This is quite remarkable. And what we had was an artist who, although his professional career was as a physician in the French military, was also a quite notable printer, landscape painter in France in the end of the 19th century. So where did he begin? He began painting landscapes, and at this image of him, you can see him. This is probably from the late 1880s. We don't have an exact date on this, but you can see that he is seated at his easel in the middle of the French countryside. He's got his palette, he's got his paintbrushes, he's got his paint box beside him, he's brought a chair, and he's settled in for an afternoon of painting. He enjoyed landscape painting, and that is primarily what he was known for very early on in his career. But where did it begin? Here's the city of Moulins, which is a small city in central France. And this is where Charveaux was born in 1847. He was the son of a headmaster and the grandson of an attorney. He spent his childhood here. It was a city that was primarily agricultural, and there was some light industry. So surrounding the city, there were fields, there were woods, there were streams, and he spent most of his time outdoors. We are very fortunate to have letters and diaries from him where he talks about his love of nature and his desire to translate this love of nature to artistic endeavors. As a young child, he created art, and he went to art school while he went to his academic school, and he won some student exhibitions. As an adult, he entered the military medical school in Strasbourg. And here we see a portrait of Charveaux created in the late 1870s, and he's in his military school uniform. It was very interesting to me that he never looked at being in the military, being a doctor, a physician, a surgeon, and being an artist as being at all in conflict. And indeed, we are lucky that from this period, we have letters that his mother wrote to him while he was in medical school. He began in Strasbourg, but then the Franco-Prussian War intervened. And because Strasbourg was situated on the German border, definitely the medical studies stopped. And he finished his studies in Paris. So his mother wrote many letters to him while he was in Paris. And she's asking about his medical studies, but she also asks about his artistic endeavors and his studies. He was interested in painting, and it was very clear that the family supported both of those works. And it's also clear that he wasn't somebody who was a physician and longed to be an artist and was dismayed that he made the wrong choice. He was someone who was happy with both parts of his life, being professionally active. While he was in Paris, he was able to study with this gentleman is Léon Bonat, and Bonat was a very well-respected portraitist and history painter. Now you see him in his studio, and his studio is not at all what we envision in modern times, where it's nothing but a sort of a paint splattered mess. You can see there's a beautiful rug on the floor. There are tapestries on the walls. There are elegant frames and furniture. So Bonat was a very successful portrait painter, and he was also what was considered an academic painter. At the time, in the 19th century, there was a hierarchy of painting. The most important paintings were religious subjects, historical subjects, very large, grand paintings. Portraiture was also respected, and towards the end of the 19th century, genre scenes, still lifes, landscapes became much more prominent than they had in the past. So although Bonat was primarily a portraitist, Charveaux actually became a landscapist. Another artist that he worked with is Félix Jacquemart, and it is indeed Jacquemart who painted this portrait of Dr. Charveaux. And when Charveaux began painting, he adopted the palette of Jacquemart. And what he said about it was, and he was writing to one of his relatives, "It's the palette of Jacquemart, which as a faithful student I've completely adopted. I found it convenient, but there is no set rule. The important, I would say the indispensable point, is to adopt a constant order in a palette that is never abandoned. In this matter, the palette becomes a veritable keyboard on which the brush moves instinctively and without effort to touch each note." So he looked at painting as something that I think was very similar to his surgical career. Because if you think of a surgeon, the tools are always placed in exactly the same place when he's preparing for surgery, and Charveaux looked at his artistic work with the surgeon's eye. Here's one of the examples of his landscapes. This is not one of the earliest ones, but it is the area around Moulins that he used for his first paintings. He was interested in the trees. This one does have quite a few buildings in it, but he was interested in the lush kind of Frenchness of the countryside. Now, the goal of all of this painting for any artist in the late 19th century was to get a work in the Salon. The Salon was a grand exhibition in Paris of artwork that happened every spring, typically in April. And the goal of every artist was to get a work in the Salon, because that was the primary way that an artist could become known and would be able to sell work. You can see in this view that the paintings were hung from floor to ceiling, and it was a fashionable event, kind of a combination I always think of: the Super Bowl, Fashion Week, the Academy Awards. It was a festive and a greatly critiqued event. It was held in the Palais de l'Industrie, which was a huge exhibition hall on the Champs-Élysées, between the Élysées and the river. And the space interior was vast. It was used for many different events, but in the spring, the Salon took over. There was an area of the Salon that was for sculpture, and then there were rooms for paintings and prints. And the interesting thing about this for an artist was that, let me go back to this for a minute. You brought your work in person so that on the appointed day in the spring, the streets of Paris would be full of artists bringing their paintings, their prints, a lorry truck with a sculpture, everything converging on this one location in hopes that eventually it would be seen by many people. You can see these great Honoré Daumier cartoons from the period. Daumier was a wonderful artist, but he also had a satirical sense of humor in his cartoons. And over here on the left, you see 3 visitors examining the works of art, and they've got a guidebook in their hands because the Salon was such a great event that there were critiques written in the newspapers and in the magazines, and then there were guidebooks that were printed so that someone could ferret out the thousands of works, find the couple that are most notable. And then of course in this cartoon on the right, you see some elegant ladies that are quickly passing through the room that has the nudes because they're horrified by the exhibition. So on the day that the artwork was brought to the Salon, they weren't hung like this, like they are finally. Instead, they were brought and placed along the floor walls, leaning against the walls, for the jury to review and to select the works that were worthy of being included. The jury were a group of august older artists, primarily people who had already won many accolades at the Salon. And what they would do is walk through the rooms, look at each work. Sometimes they would have a vote and raise their sticks, yes or no. And they would either accept a work, sometimes they would discuss it, or they would reject a work. So the Salon jurors were all powerful and they could make or break a career. Because at the time, the way to success was to have your work included in the Salon. We hadn't yet reached the point where there were galleries, so the sales were most important and the reputation of the artist was made at the Salon. Acceptance assured the beginning of a career and rejection was considered traumatic. So if your work was accepted, then the artist's work would be hung, and in the room, it was considered most prestigious if your work was hung closer to eye level. And then if your artwork was hung way up top, close to the ceiling where it was dark and you couldn't really see it very well, oh well, you were included, but it wasn't considered a prestigious placement. The day before the Salon opened would be what's called the Vernissage, where the artists would come, and you can see some on the ladders, and they were able to put a last coat of varnish or oil on the painting so that it would look its best, or adjust the frames, do whatever they needed to do. Now, to get rejected, however, was not at all anything that an artist ever wanted. And there were cartoons created about this as well. You can see up here the artist who is so dismayed. The caption says something like, oh, if they don't want to take it, no one will take it. And he's destroying his own artwork. And then down here below, the artist who's saying, they didn't accept my work. How could that be? Look, it's wonderful. And then most artists would trot back home very dejected, like this gentleman, and his workers are carrying the paintings that all have refusé, or a big R on the back of them, which would mean refused. And when they wrote that on the back of a painting, the artist might as well have started over because very few people wanted to buy it after that. So for Charveaux, his first attempt at the Salon was in 1876, and happily his work was accepted. I'm showing you this because it's kind of interesting. Every year the Salon published a catalog, which was basically a listing of every single artist that was on display that year. This was different from the reviews and the critiques that would appear in journals and newspapers and guidebooks. This was just the listing of who was included. So there is a publication like this for every year of the Salon. Different academic institutions have them now. I went to Paris as part of my research to the National Library there and looked through every salon catalog to find Charvot. And here he is, listed in the painting section. He's listed, he was born in Moulins. He is the student of Giacometti and Bonat, and his entry was an oil painting called Un Chemin Creux, which is a sunken little road, and it was a landscape of the countryside around Moulins. I think this painting might be in the Moulins Museum, and if it is, it's the one that's in terrible condition, but we don't really have this one. So, one of the most important jurors of the Salon was Bouguereau, Adolphe Bouguereau. And he, of course, is known to the Cummer as the artist of our beloved Return from the Harvest. I know it's been on loan. I understand it's back at the museum. I'm not sure it's back in the gallery yet. Charvot did not like Bouguereau. In 1879, he attempted to have another painting accepted by the Salon, and it was rejected. And Charvot blamed Bouguereau for the rejection, calling him that hideous Bouguereau in a letter to a relative. And he had nothing good to say about the man. So it is now poetic justice that the Cummer collection owns a Bouguereau, more than one, but this is the largest one. And very often it is in the same gallery as one of Charvot's North African paintings. So it took a few years, but Charvot got his due. Here we have a group. This is probably the medical school faculty, because after Charvot graduated from the medical school in Paris, he became a faculty member. And we can see him here in the back row, the fourth one from the right. He enjoyed teaching. His specialty was surgery, and he was still in the French military and would remain in the military for his entire career. So from Paris, he then was sent to North Africa. Now, this is a view of Africa from actually his daughter Yvonne's geography book, published at the turn of the 20th century. And you can see that so much of what we have in our maps in terms of countries doesn't exist at that point. The Sahara Desert is a big blank space, and indeed much of the Sahara was not even explored or mapped until the 1920s. But the area that interests us for Charvot is French Algeria and Tunisia. Charvot was sent to Tunisia in 1885. Now, Tunisia had become a French protectorate in 1881. It was actually part of the Ottoman Empire from sometime in the 1500s, I think like 1574. And in 1881, it became a French protectorate. There was a ruler called the Bey, and it was called B-E-Y. It was a beylik. But for all intents and purposes, by 1884, the French governor was the ruler of Tunisia. Tunisia in the 19th century had become somewhat modernized. They had modernized their army and their navy. They had gotten rid of pirates. They had made attempts to become more a part of the modern world. Tunisia was also considered a place where people would expatriate from France to start businesses, and the French military presence was not necessarily a negative. It was more like just a force that was there, a police force. So for Charvot, as the artist, this was a radically different place, completely different from anything he had seen in France. And in the beginning, he had intense discomfort. We know this because 1885 to 1886, we have letters that he wrote to his niece Henriette, and you can see a portrait of Henriette on the left. Henriette was also an artist, and we found an entry for her. Here she is, Henriette Dorbach Charvot. This is from 1909. So in the 1880s, she's a teenager. And Charvot wrote to her religiously. He told her, "I am going to make a journal and talk to you about art. I will write all the time, and you and I can talk about paintings and artistic process and how to become an artist." He also talked quite a bit in these letters about what he saw around him. It was a very difficult posting for him at first. He first landed, and here are a couple of his letters that you can see. He wrote about what he saw, about what he thought, about different kinds of art, and he included wonderful little sketches for her to see a little bit of what he was seeing. Some of the sketches were these wonderful watercolors, and Charvot's daughter Yvonne liked them so much that she cut them out of the letters and put them in a frame so that she could look at them. So on the back of each one of these tiny little pieces of paper is a little bit of writing, part of the back of the page of the letter. When he first arrived, he was in La Goulette, which was the port city for Tunis. And most of his drawings, and he writes very little about that because he was pretty much stationed there. He couldn't go into the city. He couldn't leave and see anything. So he's painting some little ink sketches with some light watercolor of boats. Then if you look at the map of Tunisia, you can see Tunis is up here, and he went by boat down here to Gabès. Gabès was an outpost. And for Charvot, it was, I think it was sort of like we would feel if we were going to the moon. He says, "My first impression was worse than bad. Gabès is sad and serves as the place of deportation for those who have committed crimes. It is nothing but a stretch of sand with a bit of oasis on the right and huts aligned at the bottom, occupied by profiteers. That area is known as Fight Town. But happily, and this is what we're looking at now, there are some compensations for the artist. Across the riverbank is an oasis, and it begins with regularly planted palm trees receding into charming paths. The river becomes more picturesque with 2 Arab villages." And that indeed is where Charvot spent most of his time. The landscapist in France, who was used to that lush green vegetation of the Fontainebleau forest, was plunked in the summertime into the far south of Tunisia. And at first he describes 122 degrees of heat, sandstorms, malaria epidemics, and at one point there was a cholera epidemic in Marseille, and so he didn't even get any mail. So what the landscapist decided to do, if he didn't have greenery, he would paint what he saw, and what he saw were streets and interesting people that were very different from the way he was in France. This is a street scene in the nearby village of Djara, D-G-A-R-A. And Djara is where Charvot spent much of his time as an artist. When he was off duty, and he talks about working all the time, especially in those first months, because there were many ill soldiers, and he was in charge of them, and he was the only physician there. But when he could steal away, he would try to do some work in Djara. And he talks to Henriette about dreaming to bring something back that is wonderful for the salon. And he sketches his ideas for paintings. And he says, "I would like to bring back a noteworthy work, and I've settled on my first idea. It will be a young girl carrying a water jug in the Oued Gabès, which is the little stream, the little river that happens when things are not so dry, with the oasis and the rocks in the background. I don't know if I can do it, but I would like to." And here's a little close-up of the girl carrying the water jug. We know that this painting, the eventual painting, this is just the sketch, was entered in the salon, but we don't know where the painting is now. But one of the things that we noticed about Charvot, was that he'd like to repeat an image when it was something that struck close to his heart. So here I show you the map, because here we have Tunis down here, Tunisia. We've got Gabes down here. And you can see these lines are the shipping routes. So from Tunis, there was a direct line to Marseille, which is why when there was a cholera epidemic in Marseille, nothing went in and out. So what Charveaux talks to his niece about is, I'm going to send you paintings and I'll wrap them up, I'll roll them, and I'll send them by ship. They get to Marseille and then they go overland to Paris where she is. And he gives her instructions on what to do with the paintings when she gets them in Paris. So, as I said before, he liked to repeat an image. Here we see the sketch of the girl, and in this painting, which is one of the streets of Djara, you can see the girl with the jug repeated again. This is not the one that went to the salon. And you can also see all these seated figures in the background. When he's talking to Henri about these, he calls them blobs of color, and he's most dissatisfied with his ability to create figures. He was quite a perfectionist, but in a good way. He realized he was limited in his ability to create figures because he had primarily painted trees and cows and farms. So what he decided to do was to improve on his figure study. But at this point, I want to pause for a minute and talk a little bit about Orientalism, which was quite popular in the late 19th century, not only in France, but in many European genres of art. So what this was an interest in what they viewed as Oriental arts, we would now call Middle Eastern. And there were some artists like Charveaux who were interested in depicting what they saw, but there were other artists who created these fantastical fantasy environments. This painting is called the Harem, and it is by John Frederick Lewis, 1876. But the idea that a male painter would ever be allowed into the harem, which would have been the private area of a residence where the women lived, never would have happened. So a number of the Orientalist paintings were created fabrications. Models were French models. Perhaps the artist had been to somewhere in North Africa or in the Middle East and had done some sketches, but typically these works were made in Paris. Here's another one of Othello and Desdemona. Very often the languid women and the dramatic theatrical pieces were for effect. They were, sometimes erotic in nature. And this one is called the Sultan's Favorite. So perhaps the architecture was realistic, but the lounging woman, again, never would have been able to be the model for a painter, and was probably a French model in a Parisian studio. I show you all of these because that is definitely not how Charveaux worked. He was a documentarian. He was a landscape painter that was interested in showing you what was in front of him. And he did like the interesting, different nature of it, but he was very much interested in showing, this is a slice of life that I am around, that I'm documenting for you. This painting from 1886 was done in Djara, and Djara was a very interesting city to Charveaux because it was near the ruins of an ancient Roman town called Takape. And what the inhabitants of Djara did was take some of the ruins to construct their own buildings. And here you can see the column in the center and these kind of things that are stacked, blocks that are stacked one on top of the other inside this courtyard area. He found this fascinating. You can also see the young woman preparing couscous, which is the staple diet of the area. It's a pasta and she's cooking in the background. She's got her pot here and she's seated in the corner. Now, if we look closely at the figure, we don't see her face. We don't see much of her body. She's there, she's turning away so that he doesn't have to worry about painting her face. She's under a draped clothing so that you don't have to see if the anatomy is correct. It's actually a very clever way of showing the interior, but also not displaying his shortcomings in terms of figure drawing. What he did do was work on his figures, and he did this by drawing the daughters of one of his friends. He made friends with a man of the village, and he spent a lot of time with him and got to know his family. And he didn't do this because he wanted to only get some sketching done. He was friends with the man. And his young daughters were happy to be his models, and the family allowed it. He talks about not being able to see any women, not in a romantic way, but just even getting into a household to see women, because the women would scurry away, and they were modest and shy, as was the culture. And he talks about, you almost have to barge into a house if you're going to see anybody. And this was the artist in him talking. But his friend's family, very welcoming, and he was known, so they let him do sketches he did sketches of the entire family. This is one of the daughters. And you can see that he's beginning to flesh out the face, get the perspectives. It's still not as detailed as it's going to be, but in the beginning, he's starting with this. And we also think that the girl in the painting is one of the other daughters. She's quite young, and he would have been able to sketch her. He writes to Henriette about his struggles, and he says, when I was in Paris, I wish I had done more figure study. I didn't want to do that. I didn't really like it, so I didn't pay attention. So he tells his niece, make sure you do figure studies, learn how to do that as an artist. One of the other things that helped him with his figure study work was that another artist came to Dijara. His name was Gustave Pinel. He was a medalist in the 1885 Salon, which was very prestigious in Charvot's eyes, because once you won a medal, you always could enter the Salon. You didn't have to go through that, bring your artwork and wonder if it was going to be refused. And Charvot talks about Pinel with great respect in his letters to Henriette. And he also is happy to have a companion, because at this point, he is the only artist. And he talks about how lonely he is in many ways. So he and Pinel become friendly. They decide to make a studio together. They go out on painting expeditions. This is one of Pinel's interiors of Dijara. And under Pinel's tutelage, Charvot becomes much more adept, he says, at creating figures. This is one of my absolute favorite paintings. It is not in the Cummer collection. It's still in the family's collection. It's called The Little Miller. And you can see the man pushing the millstone around. And I love the lines of this. The composition is so unlike many of his others. But you can see he's getting bolder in terms of the figures. He's got a figure in motion. You can see the exertion that the man is using. It's still not a whole lot of detail in the face, but he's making progress in terms of his work with figures, and he credits Pinel with that. This painting by 1888, we'll talk about it a little bit later. He did it in Tunis, but you can see that the figures are much more pronounced. They're forward facing. We get to see their faces. They're more anatomically correct. He's got a seated figure. He's got a standing figure. He's much more comfortable with the idea of figures. So from this period, 1886, he begins, and we will see as we progress through, figures become more and more important in his work. So from Gabès, he only has to stay there for a year, and he writes to Henriette, thank goodness they're sending me back to Tunis. So he goes back to the Mediterranean, to the city of Tunis. And now Tunis is quite a large city. It is separated, it has an Arab quarter called the Medina, and it has a French quarter. the Medina was very picturesque for Charveaux in terms of, very rich in terms of subject matter for paintings. He loved the architecture, he loved the streets, he loved the towers, the minarets. He talks about the drama of the street. And the interesting thing about Tunis was that the Arab quarter was in side by side with the French quarter. In many other places, the Arab quarter would have been destroyed, but in Tunis, the Medina had the Kasbah, which was the fort, and also the souk, which was the bazaar. And these are postcards that Charveaux collected there. And he writes that everywhere in the Medina, you see the domes of the mosque rising in the sky. Now, at the edge of the Medina was the Porte de France, which was the entry to the French quarter. And in the French quarter, you would find the cathedral, which was very much a sort of a Romanesque style building. And more importantly, you would find the French neighborhood, which, if I didn't tell you, you could believe was somewhere in France, in the suburb of Paris. It was very interesting that these two worlds lived side by side. So Charveaux spent most of his time in the Medina. He talks about the streets that he finds. This is the Rue Pasha that's in the Cummer collection. He also complains that in the heat, his oil paintings are like watercolors, and you can see this happening here. He looks for architectural settings. There are still some figures, but this is the one that becomes the most important to him, and indeed becomes one of the entries into the salon. And it's a precursor for his most well-known work, which is in the Cummer Gallery, the Rue El Alfajouen. This was his most prestigious work from the North African period, and he used it, he displayed it at the Salon and also in the Geneva, Switzerland Municipal Exhibition in 1898. For this one, he made a number of studies that he used as preliminaries. We can see this noble gentleman that's on the right over here in the painting. We can also see this man who's ready to hold something. He's holding the donkey reins. And Charveaux also created little vignettes that he may or may not use in a later painting. And you can see the unfinished nature of the edges of this one because it's a sketch, and the more finished nature of the exhibition piece. Now, at this point, his friend, the painter Friant, visited, and Friant painted this portrait of Charveaux. You see him in his military uniform. This is 1887 or 88. And in the background, you see a carpet, sort of an Orientalist background. And this indeed was Charveaux. He called it his most prized possession. Unfortunately, his letters to Henriette end at this point. He goes back to Paris for a posting, but then he's in Constantine, Algeria from 92 to 96. And we don't know much about this other than I have this postcard from him. But we do know that when he was in Tunisia, he met this woman, Marie-Angélique Eugénie Valérie de Rostino, known as Eugénie, and he drew a number of pencil portraits of her in 1892 that are just beautiful, greatly detailed. You can see he's not afraid of figure drawing at this point at all. And you can also see the affection he is developing for his subject, because in 1896, Charveaux retired from the military, and in 1897, the two were married. Eugénie was a young widow. We know that she arrived in Tunis in 1881 with her first husband, who then passed away. And she and her daughter, Gabrielle, when she married Charveaux, they moved to France with him. They first lived in Geneva and then in France. And this is a wonderful wedding portrait. You can see the wedding ring on her hand prominently displayed that Charveaux made of his now wife. So 3 years later, in 1900, the Charvaux had their daughter, Yvonne, and it was Yvonne who eventually gave the work to the museum. These drawings were done in 1904, and you can see how much he has progressed in terms of figure. These are chalk drawings, and they are quick, they are beautiful, but they are greatly detailed. The surgeon's hand is always apparent in his work. The Charvaux settled in a small town outside of Paris called Créteil, which is now pretty much a suburb. It was an agrarian area, and Charvaux was able to go back to his drawing and his painting. At this point, he did a number of very detailed pencil sketches. You can tell he had time, and he loved the river Marne that flowed through Créteil. He used the Marne everywhere. If you see this group of trees, they appear again. You can see we're looking at the Marne from different perspectives in his different drawings. And it was at this period that the biggest artistic change in his life happened. He became an etcher. He talks about etching as being this mysterious process with acids and copper and wax, and he never thought he could master it. But a young etcher showed him what it was, and this changed his life, and he never really looked back and was working as a printmaker for the rest of his life. And he says at one point, he says, you know, at one point in my life, I created Orientalist paintings, but I'm not an Orientalist. I love the fields, the countryside of France. I'm a Frenchman, and I want to bring the beauty of the countryside to my artwork. So this little painting, this watercolor from 1898, is called Chemin Creux. I wonder if it might be like the painting that was exhibited first in the Salon of 1876, but indeed it became one of his very first etchings. It was the basis of his etchings. Now, for those of you who don't know, etching is a process. A copper plate is coated with wax, and a very fine point instrument called the stylus carves through the wax to expose some of the copper, and then the wax-coated copper plate is submerged in an acid bath, and where the wax has been removed, the acid eats away at the copper, and there are lines created. So then when the plate, the wax is removed, the plate is inked, and a print can be made from it. Charvaux at this point used sketchbooks all the time. We've got the sketchbooks in our collection. And remember I said there were always cows. Cows were one of his first and most beloved subjects. In his print diary, he talks about cows. He talks about their eyes, how beautiful they are. You know they're gentle creatures. You know they're wonderful. He liked cows. So you can see he created a painting from the sketch, and then he also used the same view in a etching. And he presents the cow kind of in the Dutch style, where you just are looking at the animal. You see this one standing here and this one with head down eating, but they're just straightforward views of the beauty of the animal in the nature. This is in a corner of the prairie. He uses the cow again. The one on the left is called the sieste, the nap. And his daughter told me that he didn't really like that one because there was too much of the cow's backside in there, but it seemed to sell well, so people liked it. This one on the right is, you can see he's developing a greater technique. The foreshadowing of the figure, he's walking out of the grasses. It's not as easy a view as that first one of the side view, and he pays a lot of attention in the sky. Some of the lines are etching, and some of them where it's darker is what's called dry point. It's something that would have been added in a later state of the print. This print was used by the Society of French Etchers, the Société des Aquafortistes, as their annual print. It was called The Storm. The animals are much smaller in this. They're not as important as the drama of the sky. And at this point in his life, Charveaux has retired. He's in his 50s and early 60s, and he waxes poetic on the countryside, the cows, the storms, the skies, the bucolic nature. He also colored some of the prints. What they discovered was that colored prints sold well, and all artists were interested in this point of selling their work. So he created black and white prints, but he also created color prints. One of the women that appears in all of his etchings is his stepdaughter, Gabrielle. This is a drawing Charveaux made of Gabrielle when she was 16, and here we have a view of her as a young woman. Gabrielle lived with them, lived nearby actually, and she was the inspiration for a number of the figures. He was inspired by the traditional friend, what we think of when we think of peasants, we think of Millet, the gleaners, and this is a Breton painting. Sort of people in action, in work. Charveaux was interested in the figures, but he was more interested not so much showing them at work, but showing them in terms of a mood at repose. This one is the young girl under the leaves, and he writes that he wanted to create a dreamy, not contemplative, but just sort of dreamy, quiet, restful pose for the young woman. She appeared in the Salon and was one of the prints that won a medal in 1904. By the time the end of the 19th century came, the Salon was no longer that important. The Impressionists were breaking out and selling their work from galleries, and the Salon was much diminished, except for the traditionalists like Charveaux, who still thought it was important. And the prints were very well received. So he created a series of 4 young women. They're all Gabrielle. And here, this is, she's in the field. And this one, he wanted to strike a more somber tone, the thoughtful tone. This one is the young girl at twilight, where she's getting ready to bring her cows back. And he talks about her being strong and sturdy and bold. He said, gone are the days where we look at the people in the fields as being oppressed and being downtrodden. She's got youth, she's got beauty, she's got vigor. Who wouldn't want to be her? So whether he had an accurate view of what it was like to work in the fields or not, that was his story, and he was sticking to it. This was one of his most popular. It was a young girl going fishing, and he captures the early morning adventure of repose, of going to fish and not having to work and having some fun. This one, as you can see, is one of the hand-colored. He also created some that were black and white. When he colored the prints, he didn't quite finish them as black and white prints. He would do the initial acid bath, but he wouldn't add any dry point, which was much darker. Instead, he would add the color. And he found that the lavenders and blues and greens sold well. As all artists were trying to make profit from their art, he also created postcards, and he created writing paper from his images. And at this point, he was considered very proficient. He was president of the Society of Aquafortis at one point, and this was his most elaborate work. It is the girl burning grasses at twilight. This is a drawing, and this is the print that came from it. And if we look at them side by side, you can see that in the printing process, once the plate is made, the image gets reversed. So while the drawing has the girl facing to the right, the print has the young girl facing to the left. Both very detailed. You can see this, he was interested in precision and detail, and he had time. He talks about this being shown in 1905 at the Salon as being so well received that he thinks it was one of the reasons he got another medal in 1906. He loved moonlight. and he tried to capture the beauty of the moonlight in his etchings. This is his most successful moonlight print, The Small Village of Rose, where he tries to talk about the luminous quality of the moon. He waxes eloquent in his print diaries about these different topics. It was quite a joy to read. And we do have his print diary in the Cummer collection, and the letters to Henriette as well from North Africa. He didn't give up painting entirely. When he would go on vacation at different places, this is the small town called Bonat, in the surrounding areas, he would go to paint and print, and he would, these are not watercolors, these are oil paintings. And these are about 1908, 1909. Now, whenever he went on vacation, however, with the family, and they, in the grand French tradition, they would go for an extended summer vacation, he would take, of course, his paints or his sketchbook with him. This is Onival, which is on the Normandy coast. And on the left, you can see a family photograph of creating a sandcastle on the beach. This young girl over here with the white hat is his daughter, Yvonne. And this is a watercolor he created of the coast at Onival. These were primarily just for family use. They were not to be sold, but they did spend some summers in Euvre, which is a town nearby Paris, about an hour. I went to visit when I was researching, and it was about an hour outside Paris. And he created a folio of prints that one of the booksellers in town agreed to sell. Typically for something like this, he did not make his own prints. He had a printer in Paris named Louis Faure. He would create in Créteil, in his studio, he would create test prints or prints for his own use, but for something professional, he would send the plates to the printer. And typically after the run of plates was made, the plate would be destroyed because there would be a limited edition. He kept a few of his plates, but many of them were destroyed. And some he sold to a magazine for reproduction, and then he would sometimes buy them back from the magazine. This is the views of Evreux. The one on the right, the clock tower, was the most important view of the town. It's the most noteworthy monument. And actually, when I went there, it was still there, and we enjoyed looking at it. This little river wasn't quite as picturesque as it was in Charvot's day, but the tower was still quite beautiful. And this view of the clock tower that dates from about 1908 was so popular that he ran an edition of it to be sold as souvenirs for tourists, because tourists of the time, they would go someplace and they would want to bring a print back with them. In 1912, when he was getting quite a bit older, the family moved back to Paris for his daughter's musical studies, and he no longer had a studio. So at that point, he focused on little quick sketches that are just charming. Some are colored, some are not, that he would sell. They were tourist sketches. And very, very late in his life, I think around 1918, he became interested in an artist named Martin, who was a pointillist. And so he, ever evolving, that's one of the things I love about this artist. He changes every decade what he's doing in terms of style. He was creating some works in a very pointillist style, but yet again, we have the bucolic French streets and the countryside and his beloved cows. So these are two portraits of Madame Charvot and Monsieur le Docteur Charvot. This portrait of Dr. Charvot is from around 1916 during the Second World War, when he returned briefly to military service. And this portrait of Madame Charvot is after that. But you can see that they were still so elegant and beautiful, and had quite a lovely life together. Their daughter, Yvonne, married somebody from Jacksonville, a Barnett, Bayan Barnett, and she returned to Jacksonville to live after World War II, or during the war, I think. And that's when she became a resident of Jacksonville and approached the museum and said, would you like to, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Let me go back. wanted to leave us. Okay, we'll leave it there. So I know some people have questions and I'm happy to answer. I've been giving you my love of Charveaux and hope that you will come to the museum. If there are any of the Charveaux family watching tonight, thank you so much for letting the Cummer be the repository of the Charveaux work. So I've got a question saying I've clearly got a passion for Charveaux. What gave bloom to that interest? And I think besides being charmed by the work, it's pretty much an art historian's dream to be able to discover the work of an artist that has been lost to history. So when I was handed the stack of work in 1999 and they said, see what you can do with this, that just sort of set me off on the detective hunt that every art historian wants to be on. I mean, from Jacksonville to the National, the Library of Congress, to the Metropolitan Museum, to the New York Public Library, to the Paris National Gallery, to oeuvre, to attics of relatives, to boxes and trunks of long forgotten letters. I mean, it's just been a fabulous adventure for me as an art historian. And somebody also wanted to know about the effect of the Tunisian heat on the paint or other materials. Yes, when Charveaux first got there, I think the heat was the most shocking change for him. And granted, he was there in the summertime, but he talks about the fact that it is so hot, he couldn't sleep at night. And then because he couldn't sleep at night, he couldn't pay attention to his patients during the day. And life became a search for sleep. And when he did try to go out and had a few minutes, the heat was so great that he couldn't sit out like he was used to in terms of landscape painting. And he talked about he would go out with his paint box and his oils like we saw in his portrait, in his photograph, but he couldn't do that because the oil paints melted. On his palette, they would become liquid, and he would try to apply them to the canvas, and it would just be a mess. So he had to put away oils until the colder winter months, and he turned to watercolors and sketching. And that's, I think, one reason why the letters have so many beautiful little watercolors in them. Okay, let's see. Do we have a piece from Di Jara in our collection? Yes. Let me see if I can scoot you forward. Oh boy, you're seeing the whole thing. Okay, we know that this one is still owned by a family, but it is Di Jara. We definitely know that this was Di Jara because of the way he describes it and because of where it was from. All the sketches and the letters are from Di Jara. This is from Di Jara, although it's owned by a family. And then this one, while it is Tunis, because it was made later, it's based on one that I cannot find. I'm not sure who has it. That was started. So this one was started in Di Jara, and whether it's the second version of something that exists or whether it's something that was started in Di Jara and finished in Tunis, those are the ones that I know began. So yes, we do have the painting of the young girl cooking couscous is from Di Jara. So somebody else wants to know, what's the most surprising discovery from my research? I think there were two discoveries. One is ridiculous and one is wonderful. The ridiculous one is I didn't know I could read French so well. I had studied French, but I hadn't used it for a long time. And all of a sudden I'm reading French right and left. And of course, using my dictionary, but still, that was a great surprise. But I think the biggest surprise was the letters, the family letters, and hearing the voice of the artist. Because so often you get all of your information about an artist from looking at the work, and you make you make hypotheses. You sort of say, well, he was probably thinking this, or she was probably thinking that. But here I had the letters in the journal where I knew what the man was thinking. And I think the most satisfying discovery was the fact that I had made the theory, put forth a thesis that he was a documentarian. Remember when I showed you the Orientalist works? And that was my thought, and I was getting it from his work. And then I found the draft of a letter that he wrote to someone that was a little bio to go with one of his works, where he says, I wasn't an Orientalist. I was just documenting what was in front of me because I had no French countryside. And that was my little eureka moment. Good, I know what I'm talking about. So another question, did he have any interaction with the French Impressionist artists of the time or knowledge of their work? Great question. His daughter said that he did not like modernism, and he was very much a traditionalist. You can see that in his prints. He was interested in the academy. He was interested in exhibiting at the Salon long after other artists had forsaken it for other venues. And if you think of him presenting the prints in 1904, 1908, that's the same time that Picasso is doing all of his groundbreaking work. So Charveaux was very much living in that traditional, academic, stable. I kind of wish that he had broken out a little bit more, but he didn't. He was very traditional. And, there was a place for that as well. Okay, somebody else asked, how do I see my work researching Charveaux add to the greater canon of art appreciation? Well, I think the fact that we've been able to resurrect an artist's reputation and put him on the map again, because the family were so kind to donate work to the Cummer, and the Cummer has been so interested in resurrecting his reputation. I think that's the satisfaction. I think it has also given me, and I think will give people more of an appreciation for academic art and the relationship of academic art to Impressionism and to things like the Orientalism. When I was studying art history in the 1970s and 80s, academic art was almost considered like cartoons in the newspaper. No, we're not going to look at that anymore. That's not worthwhile. And now there's been a resurrection of it. We've got our beautiful Bouguereau in the gallery, and people are appreciating it. So I think any time an artist is brought back to prominence, it contributes to the appreciation. All right, that's it. Thank you so much. Time is up. I hope we didn't go too far over. I appreciate you coming, and I hope that you will go to the Cummer and look at the work of Charveaux. And if you are interested, there's a wonderful little book that you can purchase in the gift shop, and all proceeds go to the museum. Thank you for being a supporter of the Cummer.